started.
Yeah,
Perfect.
sure.
So welcome to our webinar today. We're looking at, this is all around troubleshooting workflows. So we'll be showing you key areas to look into when you're unsure of why your workflow may not have been sent.
Yeah, and the session will be recorded and it'll be available on the on-demand page later.
And we'll have a look at today's agenda. So today we are covering checking your workflow instances. So this is basically when a workflow hasn't sent, looking at the 4 areas to check. So that's what we're going to be running through. So the first one is checking your workflow instance, checking your workflow details, checking the workflow actions, and finally checking your workflow rules. So we'll wrap up at the end with a Q&A. If you've got any questions as we go along, please pop them in the box and we'll do our best to answer those as we go.
Sure. Yeah, so this is us. I'm the customer support advisor, the dinosaur. I've been here 20 years. You've probably raised tickets with me or spoke to me. I spoke to more to you daily, so you know who I am.
And I'm Jack, one of the customer success managers here at Access Planet. So let's jump in.
Yeah, so support desk get a lot of questions about workflows. I would say it's probably the number 2 thing we get asked about report writing, and then it's workflows. We typically get people inquiring about setup issues, in other words, rules, and they expect something to have gone when it hasn't, and they think it's broken. And typically, well, usually it's a case of how it's been set up. So it's good to know where to start to check these things.
Yeah, so as I said earlier, there's 4 areas to check, and we can treat this as a checklist really to understand why those workflows may not have triggered. So why your email not have sent, for example. So as I mentioned, there's 4 areas for us to look at. So the first one is which are the workflow instance. So we'll be going through this in a lot more detail when we look at understanding the workflow errors, but we're going to give you a quick overview of it now. If it doesn't answer our question, then we're going to look at the basic details of the workflow. So we're going to make sure that things like this turned on. If that doesn't answer the question, then we'll look at the action in the workflow. So here we're checking for things like that the right recipient has been selected, or that we've even selected a recipient at all. And then finally, we'll check the workflow rules and have we any rules in place that are stopping workflows from sending when we want it to send. So first, as I mentioned, we'll look at checking the workflow instance. So if you're not familiar with this term, a workflow instance is generated when an item in the platform meets the creation rules for a workflow. So it then will sit there until it's time to be triggered. So what we're looking for is, has an instance been generated? If it has been generated, has it been actioned yet, or is it still in waiting to be actioned? And then finally, if it has been actioned, has it failed or has it been successful? So we'll have a look at how this works. So we're going to find our delegate and that we should have had an email sent. So we'll navigate to the class delegate smart grid. And in this case, we'll look for our delegate, which we found here at the top. We'll right click and then edit, and we'll go into this delegate. Then on the left-hand side, you can see that we've got workflow instances. So we'll go into that. And then when we're in workflow instances, this is going to show us every workflow that this delegate has successfully met the creation rules for, whether it's been triggered or not. Make sure you've included the title of the workflow within this data grid. That's going to make it so much easier to see and find what you're wanting to look for. We're then going to right click and see the actions for the workflow. So you can see here, these are the actions that have been set up for this instance. Here we can see there's two actions for the delegate cancellation workflow. And this means an email to the delegate and an email to the manager, and we can see when they've been completed. We can see going into a different one that the course date reminder has not been actioned yet, so that's still currently got a status of active. And no date's completed from the action date. We can see it's actually not meant to send until July 25. And then finally, we can see from the join instructions email that this one has failed, and we can see that we've got an error message here. This is going to help us diagnose what the problem is. We'll pause on that today. We're not going to be touching on these error messages today. If you have any questions about this sort of error message when you see them, pop a ticket in and our support team will be able to help you.
We can step through them.
So using this information, we can learn if a workflow has been sent, if it hasn't sent because it's not due to send yet, or if it hasn't sent because we've got an error like the one we can see on the screen right now.
So if that didn't answer your question why workflow hasn't sent, we'll move on to checking the workflow details. There are only really 2 things when checking the workflow. So is the workflow enabled? It catches people out all the time. If it's not enabled, the tick box isn't on, it's not going to send at all. So that's your first error. And the second one is, does the workflow module match the item you're expecting? In other words, delegates, courses, invoices, they've got to be paired the same. Otherwise, it won't work. Here's confirmation of classroom booking workflow. We can see that it's active. This means that the workflow will be triggering when the rules are met. So that's good. It's using class delegate, so it won't work for web delegates. It won't work for class placeholder, which is important. If workflow is on and it's for a class delegate, we can move on. So that's correct.
Perfect. So the next one that we're going to look at is workflow actions. So workflow actions are where you define what should happen when your workflow rules have been met. So in most cases, workflows have one action, but there are times where workflows have multiple actions. So it could be that you send in a reminder at different intervals, and each action would be for a different each reminder. So when we're checking workflow actions, we're looking at who the recipient is, when the action should be sent, and then finally, whether we're limiting the action to only send on the action date. So we're going to dig into these a little bit more now. So you can see this is the only workflow action for our confirmation of classroom booking workflow. We can see that the workflow is due to send in 5 minutes after the current date time. And this means that after 5 minutes when the workflow rules are met, the email is going to send out. If a delegate was booked over 5 minutes ago, then the email should have sent out perfectly. If our delegate was only booked on 2 minutes ago, we know that we've got to wait a few more minutes for that email to send.
Yep.
We can also see that the action here is not limited to send on the action date. So this means that if the email still hasn't sent after 5 minutes, it won't be blocked from sending. So this one isn't the reason why our workflow wouldn't have sent in this case. And finally, we need to check the recipient. So currently this workflow doesn't have a to address selected. So this is going to stop the email from sending because there isn't anyone selected to receive the email address. This happens quite a bit too. People not having the right one, nothing selected, so it's not got an email to send it to. However, even if a to email address had been selected, you'd also check this setting to make sure it's the right to address. For example, the delegate's account may be included and the delegate themselves actually excluded, meaning their employee will get the email but not themselves. So sometimes check that it's not missing. That's a classic example of where things go wrong. And also that it's going to the right person, because sometimes it's going to the booker, for example, instead of the actual delegate.
Yeah, some people set that up to themselves originally, don't they?
Yes,
when they're testing things. So they say, oh, it's the customer didn't receive anything, but in the implementation stage, they put their own email in there. So that's very typical. So if workflow actions looks good, action date good, right recipient good, check workflow rules. The workflow rules for the confirmation of booking workflow. This is a class delegate workflow. So workflow instances will be generated for classroom delegates that meet these rules. Let's compare to the delegates data grid. All delegates meet the rules except Lanny. If our example was Lanny, then we'd have our answers. They didn't receive the workflow because they didn't meet the rules.
And just to go over why they don't meet those rules, if we just go back a slide, you can see here that the status is in booked. That's our second rule here. But if we go back onto this actual data grid, you can see that Lanny's in cancelled. So all the others are booked, Lanny's cancelled, so Lanny isn't going to meet those rules.
Yeah.
And that's a troubleshooting workflow. And just a quick recap on those troubleshooting steps. So the first one is check the workflow instance. Is there an instance? If there is, has it been triggered yet? If it has been triggered, has it been successful, or have you got an error message? If you get that error message and you're not sure why, pop a ticket in and our team will be able to help you a bit more on that one.
Absolutely.
If that doesn't answer our question, then we're going to check our workflow. Is it turned on? Is it using the same module as our item? If that doesn't answer our question, then we're going to look at the workflow action itself. Who is the recipient and what is the action date? And then finally, we're going to check the workflow rules. Does our item match the required rules?
Yes. Does anyone have any questions for us on anything we've covered at all there?
We've got a couple of questions that we received before this, so we'll go through those just whilst anyone pops those questions in. So the first one is, why can't I see the success or failure information directly from the workflow instances page? Why do we need to open it in a pop-up? Yeah,
it could be multiple actions per instance. Some might be successful, some might fail. So you can't display all the instances on one page. So it's a bit tricky to do that.
That makes sense. Another one, what happens to the queued up workflow instances if a delegate is deleted?
Very good question, this one. All future instances are removed. I often get this where people have taken someone off a course and put them back on for whatever reason. And it's actually, they're expecting everything to carry on, but that's not the case. So it's a good reason to keep them so the emails send anyway for a workflow. This can be changed by yourselves. But yeah, if you've added somebody on, don't expect the original instances to be there. So it catches people out that a bit.
Yeah, and I've got another good one, which is what do I do if there's not even been an instance for you to check in the first place?
Well, we can switch on some enhanced login. So again, this is just another case. Typically, the rules haven't been met at all. The term error is a little bit misleading because it just means that the rules haven't been met. It doesn't mean something is broken. So what I like to say in this instance is if you get in touch with us, we can switch on some extra logins. We would do something that would effectively trigger the same workflow. And if it doesn't trigger it at all, we have a log that tells us that it's basically, it means it's nowhere near the rules. So that's typically what that means. Yeah, I think that covers that one.
Perfect. Yeah, I don't think we've got any more questions coming in at the minute, but if anything does come up afterwards, you can either always open a ticket with the support team or speak to CSM. We can always help guide you in the right direction too. So yeah, if there's no more questions, we'll look to start to wrap up.
Sure.
Thanks to all for your time today. Hopefully it was helpful. Hopefully you've got a bit of information from it. If you've got any questions about the modules or any other support with workflows, pop a ticket in, as I mentioned, through the support portal. Thank you all again for joining and have a great rest of your day.
See you later.
Bye.